On to oral questions put by members to ministers. The leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Official Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, during the recent election, the Premier said that he supported the establishment of a clinic for veterans at Camp Hill, and he thought the federal government should be the first place to go for the funds. Premier, I know, Mr. Speaker, knows that this clinic has been a project for Sergeant Rowley Lawless and his fellow members of the Veterans Memorial Medical Centre Society, that they've worked very hard to make this clinic a reality for all the veterans of Nova Scotia. I'd like to ask the Premier if he's had a chance to have any discussions with the federal government about funding this clinic.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition for this question. As we know, this is a very serious question that he's brought to the table, and he's absolutely right. In principle, I support the concept that he brought forward during the election campaign. Prior to the election campaign, the former Minister of Health was working with his colleagues at the national level in and around a strategy for mental health issues for our veterans. Today, the federal government announced a program that they're beginning to move forward on, and part of that will be what are the next steps for the national government. I believe the federal Minister of National Defence will be here at the forum that is being held in early November, and at that point is my chance to get an opportunity, hopefully, to sit down with him face-to-face to discuss the possibility of where Nova Scotia fits in that overall strategy.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Speaker, and I know this won't make the news tonight, but this is something that I believe the Premier and I, and I'm sure every member of this House, are in agreement on, and I just want to make note of that. Mr. Speaker, an increasing number of our veterans retire from the Canadian Forces with PTSD or occupational stress disorder. For these brave veterans, waiting in an emergency department can re-traumatize them. This is why a walk-in clinic is so important. Not having a facility that is sensitive to the unique needs of our veterans puts them at risk and makes it harder for them to get the medical help that they need. I'd like to ask the Premier, if we are unable to secure the funding from Ottawa for this important service for our veterans, will he commit to going forward as the province of Nova Scotia to make sure this clinic becomes a reality?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. The Minister of Health is working with our partners across the province to continue to ensure that we have the appropriate mental health services across Nova Scotia. We know the challenges that are being faced. We heard there are adolescent young Nova Scotians who were impacted by mental health issues. Mr. Speaker, we're responding to those needs. We'll continue to respond to the citizens of our province. We'll look for the national government in the next step of what they're going to do in and around providing the proper supports for our veterans, Mr. Speaker, and we believe that the national government should be the one that specifically funds the ones related to veterans.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I am happy to support the call for the federal government to provide this important service. I do say that it is important to all Nova Scotians that our veterans get the care they need. There are 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor. Primary health care is a big issue in this province. We have many, many veterans who have unique primary health care needs. I do want to urge him to consider moving forward and work out the funding with the federal government as step 2. Mr. Speaker, you'll have our full support if he does that because of the urgency of the situation. In the meantime, I would like to ask the Premier what measures the government is taking to ensure veterans receive the primary health care that they need at this time.
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Speaker, thank the Honourable Member for the question. The Minister of Health is working with our partners to ensure that all Nova Scotians have access to the mental health issues, supports around mental health issues. This budget has an investment into continuing to provide those supports across our province that would deal with the issue of those veterans who are retiring in our province. But to the point that the Leader of the Opposition has brought forward, the Leader of the Conservative Party has brought forward, we do believe the national government has a responsibility to ensure that the men and women who defend our country, who defend the values of this country, deserve to have those supports in the communities where they choose to retire. And Mr. Speaker, we believe that there should be one here in this province. We're going to continue to make sure that what the national government does builds on what's already happening in this province for the citizens of this province, but specifically will address the issues that the men and women in uniform have.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. People across Nova Scotia have been trying to understand since this summer why this government would have reversed their previous stance against tire burning in Nova Scotia, a position they'd held so strongly that a Liberal member had even introduced a bill here to ban the burning of tires. Yesterday, the Halifax Examiner may have shed some light on this when they revealed that the Premier's campaign director in a number of provincial elections was hired by Lafarge in October of 2014 to lobby the Liberal government on their behalf. So I asked the Premier, does this lobbying arrangement meet his standard of integrity in government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have not been lobbied by anyone around tires.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. After the 2013 election, the Premier's same campaign director was hired by Terranet, an out-of-province firm looking to profit from the privatization of our motor vehicle and other registries, so that we have an individual close to the Premier and to the Liberal Party paid by out-of-province firms to lobby the government of Nova Scotia on their behalf. So I wish to ask the Premier, can he understand why people would find this arrangement troubling and concerning?
The Honourable Premier.
Again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question, the issue he raised around Terranet to come into the province. It's the responsibility of all governments. How do we deliver services in the best possible way, the most cost-effective way to Nova Scotians? We assessed that, Mr. Speaker, and chose not to do it. I'm not sure if he's trying to make a case for himself or he's actually trying to reassure Nova Scotians that I haven't been lobbied on any file and will do what's right in the best interest of all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you. This type of situation is corrosive of public trust. It deepens public cynicism about public affairs, and it undermines public confidence in democratic institutions. The time has come to tighten up rules around lobbying in Nova Scotia, and I would like to ask the Premier if he shares this opinion with me.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know who's been lobbying the honourable member when he's in government. Mr. Speaker, we've continued to do what was in the best interest of all Nova Scotians. We continue to make the decisions that we believed would be respected by all Nova Scotians, was the best interest of all Nova Scotians, the most cost-effective way of delivering services in a sustainable way. Mr. Speaker, we heard today from the Federal Budgetary Office who said there's only 2 provinces in Canada that continue to control their finances and actually can invest, quite frankly, in programs and deliver tax cuts, and one of them happens to be Nova Scotia, and we'll continue. Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to make decisions that are in the best interest of all Nova Scotians. Let me be very clear to that member and to anyone outside of this province house who wants to lobby this Premier. I will make decisions on the best interest of every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Earlier this week, we heard from members of this House who stood and discussed the impact a diagnosis like PTSD or an occupational stress disorder can have on a person. And as the member for Sackville-Cobequid pointed out, from his own experience, Mr. Speaker, this is not something that one can anticipate or prepare for until it happens. So many of our brave men and women who have protected our country have experienced things that leave them with scars that we cannot see and an impact that we cannot know. Our veterans, Mr. Speaker, deserve the best care this country and province can provide. My question to the Minister is, does the Minister acknowledge the challenges that veterans face and agree that there should be alternatives for them?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work that takes place, Mr. Speaker, recognizing the circumstances and the relationship between the Federal Department of Veterans Affairs and the role that the provincial government, Department of Health, Nova Scotia Health Authority in providing the health services to our veterans, those men and women who have fought and served this country. That's why we work together with the Department of Veterans Affairs. An example of that working together would be in 2016 when we opened the VAC Operational Stress Injury Clinic over in Dartmouth, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to work with our partners at the Veterans Affairs to continue to provide the best services for our veterans.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after many years of losing people to mental illness and stress disorders, finally, we are growing more and more aware. This does not mean that we're without tragedies. Those who have put their lives on the line are sadly among the most deeply impacted by the horrors that they witness. In a province that has more than 100,000 people without a family doctor, it should not be surprising to the Minister that we want to answer the call from veterans to provide them with the primary health care that is sensitive to their situation, Mr. Speaker. We believe we owe these brave veterans a basic debt of gratitude by providing medical center that will not cause them any further strife. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, will the minister commit to funding a Veterans Medical Center at Camp Hill so veterans can receive the necessary medical care that they so dearly deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member would know, again, the importance of the role and the service provided by our veterans, those men and women who have served this country to protect our freedoms and indeed the democratic institution that we have the privilege of serving here is critical. But also, Mr. Speaker, as the member would know, as the Premier spoke about earlier, we do support working with our federal partners to implement and enhance the services where we can for our veterans to ensure they get the treatments, whether they're in mental health or other treatments, the best way possible. And we'll continue working with our federal government to ensure that happens. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. The statements made by the Minister of Health to media and in this House this week concerning the pending Doctors Nova Scotia lawsuit led to a letter published in All Nova Scotia today from the Chair of the Board of Doctors Nova Scotia. The letter takes issue with the minister's attempt to distinguish Doctors Nova Scotia from the province's physicians, and the letter reminds the government in no uncertain terms that Doctors Nova Scotia is the province's physicians. I would like to ask the Premier if he thinks the minister's offending Doctors Nova Scotia in the Legislature is a helpful recruitment and retention strategy.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Today, someone would know well, Dr. AJ was on the radio taking exception with the way government was taking on her union. Mr. Speaker, I don't know of any other union in this province that the taxpayers pay for. Mr. Speaker, what we fund, quite frankly, medical benefits, dental benefits, services providing maternity leave. The province of Nova Scotia funds those benefits, and we continue to fund those benefits, Mr.
Please.
Speaker.
The Honourable Premier has the floor.
We will continue to pay those benefits no matter what happens, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to deliver those benefits, but what we will not do is allow $4.4 million to be put over into the union. Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member wants to defend the unions across this province, membership pays for their union dues, Mr. Speaker. This side of the House is going to take tax dollars and deliver into services for the people of this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. We hear in this response, Mr. Speaker, the very same type of denigration, in this case of doctors, that earlier this year we heard about teachers, and which brought us to the first ever province-wide teachers' strike in our province's history. At the heart of the disaster of that strike was the Premier's frequent, although thankfully unsuccessful, attempts to separate teachers from their union. So I want to ask the Premier if he thinks it is appropriate for him and his health minister to be insulting the physicians of the province in a way now parallel to what had been attempted earlier with teachers.
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, at the heart of all these issues, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that an NDP government, Mr. Speaker, rolled over and paid a 7.5-cent pay raise, Mr. Speaker, in 3 years, the largest agreement in the...
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
That is fundamentally at the heart of what we're talking about. How can the taxpayers afford a sustainable public service, Mr. Speaker, by treating people
Order,
equally?
please. The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River will come to order. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to treat people equally. We've been to the bargaining table with every one of the unions the honourable member refers to. We actually have an agreement with Doctors Nova Scotia, but I want to be very clear about this, Mr. Speaker. I want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. We have paid for the services that are in there, whether medical benefits, dental benefits, maternity leave, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to do so, but we will not take taxpayers' dollars, Mr. Speaker, that we need to deliver surgeries across this province, to invest in classrooms that you cut $65 million out, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to use those precious tax dollars that are in a sustainable, thoughtful way for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think we're back to the same old question period now. My question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the issue between the government and doctors has nothing to do with the contingency fund the Premier is speaking about or with the contract itself. It's with the accuracy of the statements made by the Minister and the government with regard to their dispute with doctors. In fact, earlier this week, Nova Scotians learned that the government's being sued by the doctors of Nova Scotia for breach of contract. The Minister said he was surprised at the lawsuit. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is very odd because in a letter to doctors that was sent yesterday, which I will table, Doctors Nova Scotia confirms that they wrote to the Deputy Minister of Health in July talking about the pending lawsuit, that they met with the Minister personally in August to tell him about the pending lawsuit, and that they would have no choice but to proceed as long as their contract remained in breach. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, why did he tell Nova Scotians he was surprised at the lawsuit when he was told about it at least 3 months ago?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite the Leader of the Opposition for the question and the opportunity to explain. The reason, Mr. Speaker, I say I was surprised about the release from earlier this week is because I was. I was surprised, Mr. Speaker, because although there were discussions in August at that meeting, it was clear that the Doctors Nova Scotia representatives laid out what their concerns, where they felt the disagreements were. The staff from the Department of Health and Wellness laid out their position, Mr. Speaker. I was there. We had discussions. I thought we laid out very clearly a path forward to move on those items. That included, in this particular case with the surplus fund, having the auditors meet. I believe the auditors had the opportunity to meet maybe once or twice in September, and then it was played out, Mr. Speaker. That's why I was surprised, because there were only 2 instances between that meeting in August and now.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to remind the Minister that everything he says is being listened to by the doctors of Nova Scotia and checked for accuracy. The Minister is accused of making unilateral changes to the APP contracts for doctors, Mr. Speaker, in breach of the agreement that his government reached with them just a year ago. Now imagine, Mr. Speaker, if a government comes to you as a doctor and puts a contract in front of you, but doesn't tell you that they've on their own made changes to the standard contract. I'd just like to table the actual APP contract so people can see for themselves what we're talking about here, Mr. Speaker. This is not a dispute with Doctors Nova Scotia. This is a government that puts a contract of 22 pages with 5 different appendixes in front of a doctor and doesn't volunteer that they've unilaterally made changes. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell this House how unilaterally changing a contract and not telling the doctors themselves is acting in good faith?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. I appreciate that the member tabled the contracts that would be entered into between physicians in the province and the Department of Health and Wellness, Mr. Speaker. I think when the member digs into the concerns being raised, and again, as I said in that meeting in August with Doctors Nova Scotia, laid out the differing positions as to what the concerns were with the changes, Mr. Speaker. A lot of that had to do with whether information pertaining to the master agreement was included or not. The way that we looked at it, Mr. Speaker, was having that information available when we provide the contract, the full details of what would cover with the doctors, the physicians entering into the contract, immediately available, as opposed to referring or referencing back to the master agreement, which of course, Mr. Speaker, all physicians would be covered by the master agreement because that does cover all physicians in the province. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the government has been talking about the contingency fund, but let's just be very clear. Doctors Nova Scotia confirms that the government conceded the need for a contingency fund at the bargaining table with doctors and signed the master agreement with the contingency fund in place. So it is very odd, Mr. Speaker, that the minister would then drain that fund after he had a signed contract in place. No wonder the people of Nova Scotia are wondering if this government's signature on a contract means anything, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the minister if he can tell the House how draining a contingency fund that he had signed an agreement to maintain is acting in good faith.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe, as the member would know, I believe if he'd reviewed that contract, it makes it very clear that that surplus fund would be drawn down. I believe the language is explicitly that the fund will be drawn down, Mr. Speaker. So again, the concerns that the member made as to why we would think that would transpire is because it's actually in the master agreement, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, since it's the government's signature on the contract, I would hope that they actually know what it says, because it says that it will be set at a level as agreed to by auditors for the doctors and for the government. Now, that is very interesting, Mr. Speaker. That's not zero, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, the minister himself said the other day that the problem was that the doctors' auditors were not forthcoming, they were slow, they were not coming to meetings, they wouldn't produce a report. That is not correct, Mr. Speaker. Doctors Nova Scotia confirms in a public letter to all Nova Scotians that their auditors met with the minister's department in February on this very issue, again in May and again in August, and provided a detailed recommendation on the level for that contingency fund. And it wasn't zero, Mr. Speaker, and in fact it was the government auditors that felt that they were not able to provide an opinion. So I'd like to ask the minister, why did he tell Nova Scotians that it was the doctors' auditors that were the holdup, when in fact it was the government itself that was the holdup?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Again, Mr. Speaker, without going into the details, perhaps the member has it. I'll leave it to Doctors Nova Scotia if they want to present all of the information between the auditors out in the public, Mr.
Order,
Speaker.
please. I will not tolerate any more disrespect for the chair. We'll ask the minister to answer the question, and the next time I have to call order, somebody will go. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, if they wanted all the information and the details between both the sets of auditors, Mr. Speaker, to be tabled, where the concerns were, Mr. Speaker, providing information, if they look closely at the information that was brought forward in the spring of the year, Mr. Speaker, it will be very obvious that the scope by which the auditors for the Doctors Nova Scotia was assessing goes well beyond the parameters defined in the master agreement. That was the concern. That is the discussion we had in August, was the concerns there. So effectively, Mr. Speaker, my concern with the delays was from August. Doctors Nova Scotia had told me while at that meeting that they delivered the updated information that had been requested at that meeting that morning to my department. It did not show up for a week later, Mr. Speaker. Talking about good faith and collaboration, Mr. Speaker, one would expect that that information would have been dropped on told that it was dropped at my department the day that we were meeting, Mr. Speaker. I would have expected to be given that information so we could have an engagement at that meeting. It didn't show up for a week later. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has just stated that he will not take taxpayers' dollars to keep a contingency fund, and this isn't a question to him, but I'm just wondering if he's asked those very taxpayers if they would mind, because the ones who've contacted me wouldn't. They would rather have that $4.1 million there because all they want is a family doctor. So today our caucus met with Alana Patterson, the Director for Physician Compensation and Negotiations. She indicated that Doctors Nova Scotia's ability to assist with the recruitment of family doctors has now been harmed by this government's year-long failure to implement their side of the Doctors Nova Scotia agreement that was negotiated in good faith. I'm deeply concerned that their recruitment efforts and mine to get one doctor from my community have become even harder, so the question, Mr. Speaker, is how does the government of Nova Scotia expect potential doctors we're attempting to recruit come to Nova Scotia when they don't have any confidence in this government's ability to accept their own contract negotiations?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How they would expect that, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that the precious tax dollars they give us, Mr. Speaker, is used to ensure that we pay for the benefits of doctors across this province, which our government has continued to do, to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the $4.4 million that the union representing doctors, Mr. Speaker, actually has been taking money that was actually to go to doctors to pay for benefits, if it's not required, comes back so we can continue to use it to continue to build our plan to recruit primary care health workers across this province.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We were reminded today that that fund is actually called the Physician Recruitment and Retention Fund, which seems kind of ironic now. My question is to the Minister of Health. There's been increased action taken by community groups, including my own of Cole Harbour Eastern Passage, to generate their own recruitment for physicians. It includes videos, meet and greets, and Facebook postings. We're aware of the government has in Nova Scotia 4 regional and 1 provincial recruitment physician recruiters. Although it's not the community's responsibility to find these doctors, we're appreciating of their efforts. So my question to the Minister of Health is, can he explain to all of us exactly what our doctor recruitment strategy is, and have they thought about committing greater financial resources to improve that strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. As I've mentioned before, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of work that's ongoing with regards to recruitment of physicians and other primary care professionals, be they nurse practitioners, family practice nurses, and others that can provide primary care services to the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I think that's an important part. The recruitment efforts are multifaceted. There are incentives that exist, Mr. Speaker, for new graduates in return for return of service contract options, which could provide funding and relief. There are our commitments in this budget, Mr. Speaker, to expand our residence positions and other initiatives going along through the province to help attract family physicians and other healthcare professionals.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday when the Premier was asked about the crisis of poverty in our province, he pointed to the change in the basic personal amount included in the budget. According to staff from the Department of Finance, the average amount a person could benefit from this change will be about $160 a year, or $13 a month. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Community Services is, what does the Minister suggest people buy at the grocery store with that extra $13 a month?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. What the honourable member will know is that we are in the process of transforming community services and how we deliver our services and what we deliver to people. At the end of this transformation, Mr. Speaker, more Nova Scotians will be able to keep more money. They will have more money to spend on food and on other priorities that they have, Mr. Speaker, not tinkering around the edges as that party did when they were in office for 4.5 years and they did nothing to transform the system.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, since 2014, this government has spent $9 million on the much-touted and anticipated transformation, while clients wait with no information and no improvement in the inadequacy of income assistance rates. Now the government is pledging $2 million to develop a plan to address poverty. Mr. Speaker, the tens of thousands of Nova Scotians living in poverty cannot wait any longer. Mr. Speaker, will the minister agree today to increase income assistance rates to allow people to buy their food from a grocery store, or is she satisfied to continue to point them in the direction of the nearest food bank? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to point out to the honourable member that under a Liberal government, last Liberal government, income assistance recipients received the largest single increase in income assistance ever. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we heard from the leader of that party, and he went on at great length about poverty rates, and he talked about the number of people needing assistance from food banks. I would just like to point out that in 2012, when the NDP were in power, 23,561 people got food from food banks. That's what that party did.
That's right. The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, Canada has the highest rates of MS in the world. Neurologists in Nova Scotia are working day and night on advancement for care of those living with MS. However, Mr. Speaker, some people living with MS can't afford to travel to their neurologists, which could mean they're not getting the care that they need to manage that health problem. There is no funding available to assist these individuals, and sometimes, Mr. Speaker, the cost for travel can be upwards of $300. My question to the Minister, does the Minister believe that this is fair for those who are facing mobility and transportation issues?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member opposite. Certainly, there are a number of health conditions that have tragic impacts on people in Nova Scotia. MS is certainly one where you see the progression and the impacts on an individual. And the severity of those impacts. Certainly, we want to see in our healthcare system is providing the best services and care. A member here recently spoke about a tour of the work and the research being done at the Dalhousie to help advance improvements in the multiple sclerosis treatments and so on, Mr. Speaker. So we're doing a lot of work to help patients in care in both on the ground and through research. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge that we're doing a lot of work to help develop MS, but that wasn't the question. The question was, if people need transportation to get services, is it available? That's the question. The government has committed to enhance the level of health care for all Nova Scotians, regardless, Mr. Speaker, of where they live. Inability to pay should not be a barrier, and neither should a person's address. So the question is, will the Minister of Health consider an in-province travel and accommodation policy for people who need to travel for their medical needs with a province this size?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and for the benefit of the member and perhaps other members who may have constituents in a similar situation requiring support for transportation. There is the OTB, or Ostomy Transportation and Board Fund, which does exist to provide some financial relief and supports for Nova Scotians that may need support with their transportation and board or lodging. Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to acknowledge the work of my predecessor for having increased the size of that fund during our previous mandate. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. This Liberal government closed 2 schools in Pictou West in less than 2 years, one in River John, Pictou Academy. Pictou Academy students, grade 9 to grade 12, are now housed in the Dr. McCullough School, renamed, though, Pictou Academy. It's total discombobulation. We were told by CCRSB that it would be the smoothest transition ever, literally 75 feet from the other school. It's a mess. If it wasn't for the teachers, the students going in and painting that school and cleaning it, it would not even have been ready. So my question to the minister is, why is he endorsing CCRSB to allow students and teachers in Pictou to work and be educated in less than satisfactory conditions?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As a legislator of the House, I know that member will be familiar with the Education Act and its subsequent regulations, which clearly articulate that those decisions do fall under the legal jurisdiction of our boards. The Department of Education does not make decisions on school closures. What we do is we take the recommendations from the board and we work with them to develop a plan for their capital needs, Mr. Speaker. So that is a process that we go through. I do not envy the boards these decisions. These are very difficult decisions that local people make on behalf of their community, and it's never easy to close schools. But of course, we want those students, those teachers, and in fact, every student and every teacher in this province to have the best learning environment possible, and we are committed to doing that.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, may be committed to everywhere else, but not in Pictou. It's a real mess. And, Mr. Speaker, the CCRSB released a press release claiming that they constructed a new functioning lab for grade 9s to 12, chemistry, biology, physics. They would have a brand new lab. A press release, October 2nd, they came out and apologized that they were incorrect, and I will read what Gary Adams said. Our Director of Operations is working with staff to confirm a plan and timeline for the updates, and I will table that. So there was no time plan. They lied. It was false information. So my question is, Mr. Speaker, can the minister please tell us how CCRSB is so out of touch with a school that is literally 10 miles away?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do appreciate in the follow-up question that the member identified that this is an issue specifically with the board. I will say that this government is endeavoring to have a full and complete administrative review of our system that involves the Department of Education and the board structure as well. So I would encourage that member to participate in that process because we do expect that to be a very meaningful process for the system that will yield some positive recommendations and results for our students, our teachers, and our communities.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think last week I asked a question about a landline service in the community of Shag Harbour having challenges, and I want to thank the Minister of Municipal Relations for looking into this on behalf of the side of EMO. I'm just wondering, maybe a week later, what has his discussions been with Bell Alliant, and those service providers that are giving such shoddy service to rural Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question and the work that we both did in supporting the constituents in your community. Mr. Speaker, I had an outlet conversation with one of the residents and some of the challenges that he faced upon getting that question. Talked to EMO representatives. The situation seemed to have corrected itself, but here we are again today with a similar situation. CRTC controls the phone lines, but of course with EMO we're always concerned when we hear these things, so we will follow up again with the member and with the particular constituent that I talked to, and we'll get some more information to see what we can do.
The Honourable Member for Argyle-Barrington.
So thank you very much for that answer, but maybe I'm going to go to the Minister of Business on this one, because there's a larger issue happening here. Our telephone service is less than to be desired. Our internet service is less than to be desired in rural Nova Scotia. And quite honestly, the community of Woods Harbour, which is just next door to Shag Harbour, barely has cell service, and there's millions of dollars of deals, of lobster deals, being done all over the world. They can't even use their iPhones in their offices because there is no actual service. So I'm wondering if the minister can bring me up to date. Do we have a unit within his department that could actually take on this issue so that we can have appropriate service technology available to our communities?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for the question. Obviously, with respect to broadband service and how we access the internet in rural Nova Scotia, this is a pressing issue for the government. It's a significant part of our mandate. This is a problem that's being faced across the country. The national government has put together a plan of about $500 million over the next few years to help provinces address this issue. We've identified $14.5 million towards broadband investment, which is one of the most significant per capita of any province in the Federation. We take this serious. We are developing a plan to have an arm's-length body administer the broadband plan. We're going to do this as soon as possible. It's a couple $100 million issue for Nova Scotia, but over time and with the right fiscal management and good investments, we'll get there. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I would love to address the Premier's derogatory comments on Doctors Nova Scotia, my question is actually for the Minister of Environment. The legacy of environmental racism in this province is not something we can continue to sweep under the rug. It's an issue that requires a commitment to understanding the perspective of racialized people whose neighborhoods have been disproportionately situated next to landfills, waste dumps, and other hazardous activities. I previously introduced a bill aimed to do just that by establishing an all-party panel to examine the issue and consult with affected African Nova Scotian, First Nations, and Acadian communities. So my question for the new Minister of Environment, will he support legislation that aims to address issues of environmental racism?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. The Department of Environment always looks at the science and evidence provided in any applications. That way we ensure a full, equitable process for all Nova Scotians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm surprised he just didn't regurgitate that it's a regulatory body. He didn't really answer the question. My second question is for the Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs. The United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent visited a number of Canadian cities last year, including Halifax, and wrote a report calling on governments to do more to redress past and present wrongs, including recommending the introducing of legislation on environmental racism. I will table that. In response to the report, the minister said, and I quote, "This document gives me some resolve. This is a document that I would urge all Nova Scotians to read," and I appreciate the minister's comment. So I'd like to ask the Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs, in all sincerity, if he will agree to join me in supporting legislation that would have all parties in this House come together to examine issues of environmental racism.
The Honourable Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to say that we are, as a government, are working on that. We are moving forward, and I support anything that our government, the community, and provincial, federal, and municipal organizations that will do to work towards correcting any of those long-standing issues. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. On April 3rd, 2012, 15-year-old Olivia Gelada died as the result of an accidental prescription drug overdose. Her mother, Dale, has become an advocate for drug education and awareness and helped develop a curriculum supplement in 2015 to address drug education from grades 7 to 9. My question for the Minister of Education is this. With a growing epidemic in opioid-related deaths and addictions, why has this curriculum supplement not been updated to include important information about fentanyl, carfentanil, and harm reduction strategies like naloxone? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That is a very important question to ask. I do want to clarify for the House that in the healthy living curriculum from P to 12, drug use, opioid use is a part of that curriculum. We are in the process of updating that curriculum, I believe, from grade 4 to grade 8, if memory serves me correctly. And of course, any subject matter expertise that we can use to enhance that would be greatly appreciated.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's response. As the Minister of Education knows, a curriculum supplement is not required to be taught in our classrooms. It must be mandated, Mr. Speaker, as an outcome to be required teaching. We have evidence of children, Mr. Speaker, in our province as young as grade 5 experimenting with prescription pills. Knowing this, my question to the Minister, why has drug education not been mandated as an outcome in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important issue. We want our healthy living curriculum to be fulsome and to educate our children in a wide range of areas that include the negative impacts of drug use and misuse. And so we are in the process of reviewing that curriculum right now. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to receive any outside expertise to help us enhance that so we can have the best product possible for our kids that will help empower them to make the best decisions possible in school and in life.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the budget documents that were presented, this year's budget documents, the biggest expenditure for the Emergency Management Office was an unplanned expenditure of $17,610,000 for disaster assistance. Last year, 2016-17, was estimated for only $376,000, and for this fiscal year, the estimated budget amount is for $302,000. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister please inform this House if the total expenditures over the $17 million last year were floods in Cape Breton Regional Municipality, and what amount may still be outstanding? If not for those floods, what was it for?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the Emergency Measures Organization.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question. That large increase in the expense reflects the flood that happened in Cape Breton. That reflects the payments that we've given out to EMO, which is approximately $14 million that has been distributed to residents across the CBRM and beyond. That also includes some of the costs associated with hall rentals and other infrastructure that we needed to support the families during the storm. So that's the reflection of the budget.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, according to the disaster financial assistance arrangements with the federal government, the first $3 million, I believe, is not qualified for federal assistance and cost sharing. There is a no note in the budget document, though, whether or not the department will be going after any of the other of the outstanding $17 million expenditure that was done. Could the minister clarify whether or not the government plans on going after the federal assistance program from Ottawa for the floods in Cape Breton over the $3 million that doesn't qualify?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Yes, again, thank the member for the question. Most of that money is going to be recoverable. We're still going through the disaster financial assistance process. Of the 1,168 applications that we've received, about 85% of them have been processed at this point to a tune of $14 million. We're still working with some of the small businesses in the community as we work through various insurance companies to determine their qualifications for the disaster financial assistance. And of course, we continue to tally the total from the flood last year in regards to some of the other expenses that were incurred through staffing disaster financial assistance folks who were helping go through the over 1,100 applications to support Cape Bretoners.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct my question to the Minister of Municipal Relations, who seems to be very popular today. This past Tuesday, the Port Hawkesbury Town Council was informed that the Property Valuation Services Corporation would be closing its office in Port Hawkesbury in February 2018. Port Hawkesbury Town Council was only made aware of the closing because PVSC needed to give notice to its lease holder, which is the Port Hawkesbury Civic Centre. My question, Mr. Speaker, is will the minister explain why PVSC did not consult with the municipalities which it serves, including the town of Port Hawkesbury, before closing this office, even though PVSC is largely funded by these municipalities?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. PVSC is independent of government. It's a standalone organization that has its standalone board of directors, and any decision to close the office would be a decision of that organization.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, this office serves the communities of Port Hawkesbury, Almadam, St. Peter's, Ludale, and Lordways are all in my constituency, but they also serve the constituencies within Inverness, Guysborough, and Antigonish as well. So this is a cut, yet again, in a long line of service reductions to rural Nova Scotia and the Strait area in particular. I'd like to ask the minister, explain to the people of the Strait area and the other broader area which the PVSC serves, why they will need to travel to Sydney or Truro over an hour away to access this provincial service.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks for the follow-up to the member. Again, PVSC is independent, so that decision for them to close that office would be the decision of their board. I do know that I've seen some media coverage from the Mayor of Port Hawkesbury expressing her concerns about the closure. I personally reached out to the Mayor of Port Hawkesbury. I haven't had the opportunity to have that conversation, but when I do have that conversation, I will relay that information to the member.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This question is for the Minister responsible for the Public Service Commission. Mr. Speaker, in the budget address, the Minister referred to our people as our greatest assets. While I would certainly agree with that idea, it is noticeable in the budget this government put forward that not a single department spent the amount that they had budgeted for staff. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister responsible for the Public Service Commission: has the Commission directed departments to leave positions vacant rather than ensuring good jobs are available for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, we have not.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our caucus requested an accounting of the use of temp services within government departments between 2015 and 2017. Across 9 departments, the government spent almost $1.5 million. Service Nova Scotia alone spent almost $900,000 on temp services. Mr. Speaker, is this minister satisfied to fund short-term, low-wage, precarious work rather than good jobs for the people of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are a government that is looking to support and increase and grow the public service. Actually, if we, as was mentioned before, we've provided a service where we've brought in 2,500 young people into the public service. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple questions for the Minister of Community Services, but I'm going to change it to the Minister of Business, Mr. Speaker. And it's a question dealing with the rail car plant in Trenton. And again, in 1995, Mr. Speaker, the Greenbrier closed the facility down and moved back to the United States, and the government at the time Did a fair amount of work in Spain, India, and South Korea looking for a potential buyer, Mr. Speaker, and South Korea came along and the windmill plant came into effect. So I guess my question to the minister is, could we have a rough list of companies that PricewaterhouseCoopers have had some serious dialogue with over the last few years?
Order, please. The time allotted for members' question has expired.